It's the 24th of June 2010, and Julia Gillard exits the Labour caucus room as the nation's first ever female Prime Minister. With an election round the corner, she's faced with a huge decision. What do you now do with Kevin Rudd? Cutting all ties with a former ally, Gillard decided it'd be better to leave Rudd in the cold than risk giving her new enemy a cabinet position. And to this, there were no two ways about it. Rudd was just flat out insulted. As Gillard went to the polls against one of the strongest opposition leaders in Tony Abbott, who, might I add, was gaining a ton of momentum, only a disciplined campaign would get her over the line. But the party was far from disciplined, and leak after leak made its way to the media. Firstly, Laurie Oakes reported on a Labour source who had confirmed that Gillard reneged on a promise to Rudd to give him more time to reverse the polling trends. But then in the second week of the campaign, there was a second leak. This time much more damaging, as it revealed that Gillard had opposed a cabinet introducing a new paid parental leave scheme and pension increases. For Gillard, there was absolutely no doubt as to who were behind these leaks: Kevin Rudd. Though Rudd later admitted to leaking to Laurie Oakes, he denied leaking the parental leave one, but that didn't matter. Gillard needed to neutralise her new enemy as quickly as possible and promised Rudd the next best thing to being Prime Minister: the Foreign Ministry. Remember, Rudd rose through Labour as first a diplomat, so this was an absolute dream job for him. When Rudd got the job, the leaks stopped, and Labour went into the 2010 polls at $1.75 compared to the Coalition's $2.70. Make no mistake, despite the leadership turmoil, the 2007 election saw such a huge swing towards Labour that one term wasn't considered enough for Abbott to close the ground. But give Abbott his dues. He was a beast of an opposition leader and a relentless campaigner. As Australia went to the polls in August, it was a truly shocking result. Labour only won 72 seats, falling a whole 4 seats short of a majority. What was also astonishing was that Abbott's Libs won 72 seats as well, leaving 4 independents, 1 WA National, and 1 Greens MP to be negotiated with to secure government. This was the first hung parliament since World War II. Now, Adam Bandt had announced before the election that the Greens would support Labour in the event of a hung parliament, so Labour went up to 73. One of the independents, Andrew Wilkie, was an ex-Greens candidate and followed suit, getting Labour up to 74. The WA National supported the Liberals to bring them up to 73, and so that left a huge amount of power in the hands of 3 independents: Bob Katter, Tony Windsor, and Rob Oakeshott. All of these were ex-National MPs, but said that they were open to going either way, depending on the offer. Katter announced he'd support the Coalition, which meant each were on 74, but then Windsor and Oakeshott announced they'd support Labour, securing them government. However, this was a government formed by the finest of margins, and Gillard couldn't afford to raise the middle finger to the Greens and Independents. In fact, the Greens Senate leader Bob Brown and House leader Adam Bandt each secured weekly meetings with the Prime Minister where they could lobby for a climate tax. So no question, this was an extremely difficult position for Gillard to be in, and Abbott almost had the better deal with a guaranteed election victory in 2013. That being said, the Gillard government passed some of the most significant reforms in our nation's recent history, and so you'd think she'd be adored by the party faithful. And no question, she is by some, but to many others she isn't. Have a read through of just how divisive your opinions were on her in the comment section of the Rudd video. But before we get to the reforms, we're not done with the numbers game just yet. So in 2010, Labour kept Rudd's appointed candidate, Harry Jenkins, as Speaker of the House. If you're new to politics, the Speaker is usually from the majority party and abstains from voting in order to be a neutral judge over the Parliament. Now, in 2011, Gillard wanted to shore up her numbers and delved into the dark arts of realpolitik. Essentially, Gillard forced Jenkins, a Labour MP, to resign from his post as Speaker of the House to be replaced by a disgruntled Liberal Party member, Peter Slipper. With Jenkins now able to vote in Parliament and Slipper having to abstain, this gave the Labour Party a crucial extra number in the lower house, meaning they weren't as dependent on Oakeshott and Windsor. Of course, the Liberal Party bitterly protested this, calling Slipper a rat and calling his appropriateness into question after there were allegations that he'd used taxpayer dollars for many personal expenses. However, in 2012, new allegations emerged around Slipper. This time, it was to do with one of his staffers, James Ashby, and this time, it was to do with sexual harassment. You see, Ashby accused Slipper of harassing him via text messages and in private conversation. Of course, this meant that Slipper's messages were made public, and it was clear he'd said some pretty sexist stuff about female members of parliament. Abbott pounced on this and asked that for the first time in Australian history, the Speaker of the House be removed, and put it to Gillard that if she didn't want to remove Slipper, she was tolerating misogyny in the chamber. Gillard responded with,
"I will not be lectured about sexism and misogyny by this man. I will not. And the government will not be lectured about sexism and misogyny by this man."
I'm actually not going to play the rest, you've probably seen it, and also BuzzFeed and co have somehow managed to convince Gen Y that this was her most significant legacy. If you ask me, it doesn't even come close, as there was real policy change that completely altered Australian society. So we left the Rudd episode by having a look at one of the key policy proposals that led to him getting rolled, the super profits mining tax. However, as the mining boom started to slow down, it was hard to argue that there shouldn't be some sort of tax placed on companies so that the nation could profit from the boom while it still lasted. And so Gillard introduced the mining tax 2.0. Well, it was officially called the Minerals Resource Rent Tax, and it was essentially just a watered down version of Rudd's proposal. So initially, the proposal was that this tax was only to be paid after profits cleared 50 million, but then Andrew Wilkie actually pressured Gillard into making it 75 million, which then made around 320 companies exempt from the tax. On top of that, Gillard slashed Rudd's 40% super profits rate down to 30%. Though Labor voters certainly supported the tax, they grew very frustrated when the tax only rendered $200 million as opposed to the expected $3 billion. Next up on the resources agenda was the carbon tax. Now, if you have even just a cursory understanding of Australian history, you might remember this iconic quote from Gillard.
"There will be no carbon tax under the government I lead."
And if Labor had won a majority, there absolutely would not have been. But remember, one of the terms of her deal with the Greens was weekly meetings with Bob Brown and Adam Bandt. If we remember back to the Rudd episode, for totally different reasons, the Greens had actually teamed up with Abbott's Liberals in the Senate to strike down the emissions trading scheme. For Brown, allowing businesses to buy carbon permits from other businesses wasn't the best approach, and the scheme was ultimately too conservative with its reduction goals. Rudd had agreed to park the scheme back in 2010. However, Gillard's carbon tax was introduced in 2011 and put a price of $23 per tonne of CO2 emissions. The scheme also only applied to facilities that emitted over 25,000 tonnes of CO2 per year, and it also didn't apply to agriculture or transport fuels. Again, Abbott campaigned on immediately revoking the tax, but while it was in, it probably led to about a 7% reduction of carbon emissions. That being said, the political damage was unbelievable, as Gillard had so clearly backflipped on her election promise, and Abbott campaigned hard on her being under the thumb of Bob Brown, though his messaging was much more vile than how I put it. As Australia was also exiting the shockwaves of the GFC, Gillard's treasurer, Wayne Swan, made the fateful mistake of promising a $1.3 billion surplus. Amidst all the leadership chaos, Australia had grown nostalgic for the stability of Howard, and of course, part of Howard's branding was regularly delivering surpluses. Unfortunately for Labor, they didn't deliver a surplus, but in fact delivered an $18.8 billion deficit. So where did all that money go? Well, actually, it went into some pretty revolutionary policy which completely transformed the nation: the NDIS. For me, it's hard to argue that there was a more revolutionary policy in the 21st century which completely transformed the lives of everyday Australian families. Now let's be clear, Gillard didn't just whip this policy out. Whitlam had actually toyed with the idea back in 1974, but was convinced by Bill Hayden to focus on Medicare instead. But in the late 2000s, the disability investment group started to put pressure on Labor for needed disability reform and actually submitted a request to the Productivity Commission. This commission found that disability was not just a social issue, but also an economic issue, as private care would end up costing the taxpayer more than a government scheme. A tearful Gillard proposed the NDIS to Parliament, and Labor committed $14.3 billion to the cause in the 12-13 budget. The scheme was to be progressively rolled out up until 2020 and was to guarantee full funding for any support needs for permanent and significant disability. So of course, this massively put Labor in the red, but let's be real, they knew they hadn't a shot of winning in 2013, and so were happy to pass nation-building economic infrastructure. On top of that, the Gillard government also sought to revolutionise education. In the Rudd episode, we didn't actually mention that Gillard was both Rudd's deputy and his education minister. And as Minister for Education, she ordered a report into education funding. The report was conducted by David Gonski, and the report found that schools needed significantly more funding to be competitive with the education of other nations. So later as Prime Minister, Gillard announced her plans to conduct a $9.4 billion funding upgrade to all schools across Australia. The issue though was that education was actually a state matter, and she hoped to negotiate agreements with each of the states as to how to split the bill. She tasked Bill Shorten with being the chief negotiator, but the premiers weren't racing to sign up. South Australia said it was a good idea, but wanted to see the federal government commit more funding. Queensland's Campbell Newman wasn't having a bar of it, and in the end, it was just Barry O'Farrell who signed New South Wales up to the scheme, on a deal where New South Wales paid $1.76 billion and the feds paid $3.27 billion. Just putting it on record, when New South Wales signed up to Gonski, I got 100% on my French test by using the French dictionary to write a story about a guy called Didier from Côte d'Ivoire. I basically just wrote a story about Didier Drogba. With results like that, the proof of Gonski is absolutely in the pudding. But you yourself don't have to pay for history resources. Check out our podcast, link in the comments. But Gillard's issues weren't just at home, because they were also abroad. The first of which was to do with immigration. So the Howard government famously towed a hard line on immigration, mainly that asylum seekers would face harsh offshore processing in Nauru and Manus Island. This was an attempt to deter seafaring refugees. However, when Rudd was elected, he dismantled offshore processing, but there was an increase in travel-related deaths. Abbott pounced on this with his signature tagline of stopping the boats. Under pressure, Gillard initially kept Rudd's policy, but then shifted to a third way forward, which was to exchange arriving asylum seekers for processed refugees from Malaysia. The High Court rejected this deal, and Gillard did the unthinkable and announced the reopening of Nauru and Manus Island. But when it came to dealing with other countries, Gillard wasn't always the one at the wheel. She said on record that foreign affairs wasn't of any real interest to her, and only on a few occasions did she become very actively involved. That being said, when she got involved, she got very involved. Firstly, Rudd had tried to position Australia as an intermediary between China and America, and was hesitant to join the Quad as China would have been encircled by the US, India, Japan and Australia. However, Gillard had no hesitation to sign Australia up, and on top of that, 200 US Marines were stationed in Darwin with the goal of their presence actually growing to 2,500. If you go back to the Rudd episode, we looked at the conspiracy of Rudd annoying the US with his mining tax, and America working through Mark Arbib to get a much more preferable leader in Gillard. Just for the record, I think it's likely, but agree with a lot of the commenters in that there's actually no smoking gun which confirms it. But Colonel Gaddafi's Libya proved to be a case where Gillard was at odds with a foreign minister, which of course was Kevin Rudd. In response to the Libyan rebellion against Gaddafi, Rudd swiftly proposed a no-fly zone enforced by the international community. This was to prevent Gaddafi from using his air force. It's weird to think, but at this stage, Obama was more cagey than Rudd in how to deal with Libya, and Gillard overruled Rudd's request. Later that year, Gillard also reversed Rudd's policy of blocking uranium sales to India for not being a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And so with the two once again butting heads, rumours of a leadership challenge surface. This time, with Rudd to take his revenge on who he viewed to be Judas. There was also this remarkable speech in Sydney where Gillard spoke of the rich Labor Party history and gave a shout out to every single Labor Prime Minister post-World War II, and by that I mean 4, with the exception of Kevin Rudd. In February of 2012, Rudd made his move, announcing from Washington that he was resigning as foreign minister and was coming home. The next day, he announced his intention to challenge, but the challenge fell well short, losing 71 votes to 31. The only high-profile names he managed to pull were Albo and Chris Bowen, while Gillard kept nearly the entirety of cabinet. At this, many of her supporters like Bill Shorten, Tony Burke and Simon Crean went into bat for her. Rudd conceded defeat and said that he'd only once again challenge for leadership if he was assured he'd have a majority in advance. The next challenge would come just over a year later, but it was an utterly humiliating one. Gillard's defender, Simon Crean, was adamant that Labor was on track to lose the 2013 election and announced he'd stand as deputy leader to Kevin Rudd of all people in a challenge against Gillard. The issue was that Rudd decided not to stand for leadership as he wasn't convinced he had a majority, leaving Crean utterly humiliated as Gillard won the ballot completely unopposed. And though Gillard emerged victorious on paper, this was a disastrous result for her election campaign, as it only added fuel to the fire that she was running a completely dysfunctional government. And as Australia approached the 2013 election, by some polls, Labor was on track to have as few as 40 seats. This meant that many MPs were about to lose their jobs and they were desperate. One of the key conspirators behind Rudd's 2010 ousting, Bill Shorten, did the unthinkable and now flipped his vote back towards Kevin Rudd. He was joined by Simon Crean and Penny Wong, as many flipped their allegiance to now give Rudd a 57-45 majority. And so on the 26th of June 2013, Gus Gould's State of Origin speech was interrupted by the news that Rudd was once again the Prime Minister, and in a great night for Queensland, they won Game 2 and the top job in Australia. And so going into the 2013 election, Rudd knew that Abbott would certainly emerge victorious, but his mission was still clear. In 3 months, Rudd was to save as many of his colleagues' jobs as possible to give them a fighting chance in 2016. But if you think the Rudd-Gillard debacle was crazy, that wasn't even half the leadership battle that was between Hawke and Keating in the early 90s. Keating even said this about his boss.
I wanted his job and I tried to take it off him. It's as simple as that.
Check it out here.